My brothers, my sisters, welcome back to the channel. Today we speak not just of Burkina Faso, but of Africa's awakening. If you believe in freedom, unity, and the power of our people, then make sure you subscribe. Share this story, and let the world hear Africa's voice. Because what you are about to witness is not just history, that is destiny. The world was watching, though none admitted it openly. Headlines screamed across continents, their words dripping with disbelief. African leader defies international law. Traoré challenges global order. Shockwaves in Washington. Moscow, Beijing. In rooms thick with air-conditioned tension, men in suits tapped pens nervously, their conversations a quiet symphony of panic and disbelief. Trump's advisors whispered frantically. Putin's generals scowled at maps pinned to walls. Xi's ministers exchanged furtive glances. No one could fathom that a single man in the heart of Africa could shatter expectations so completely. Ibrahim Traoré, young yet unshakably confident, stood at the center of the storm, his eyes scanning the horizon as if daring the world to stop him. What he did next would change the map of power forever. Burkina Faso, his homeland, bore the weight of decades. Streets lined with cracked asphalt led to villages where children scavenged for scraps, where mothers bore the hunger in silent resignation, where elders spoke softly of dreams that had long since died. Traoré had walked these streets countless times, feeling each pang of despair as a personal indictment. The shadow of Thomas Sankara lingered like a whisper in the wind, a reminder of courage and vision lost too soon. The people had suffered under layers of imposed rules, dictated not by necessity but by distant powers that saw Africa as a ledger, a line item to exploit. International loans, foreign interventions, and outdated agreements had strangled his nation, leaving it gasping for breath. Traoré could no longer stand by. He remembered the countless nights poring over documents, the dim light of his office lamp illuminating plans the world would deem impossible. He studied laws meant to bind his nation, treaties designed to siphon wealth, and the mechanics of economies that had long favored outsiders over his own people. The IMF demanded gold reserves, insisting on compliance with archaic financial systems. Ministers, fearful and timid, urged caution, warning him of global backlash, of sanctions, of the isolation of his nation. Yet Traoré saw beyond caution. He saw the lifeblood of his people stagnating, their dreams buried beneath centuries of compliance. And he realized that sometimes to save a nation, laws themselves must be challenged. Secret meetings unfolded in dimly lit rooms scattered across Ouagadougou, in abandoned warehouses and quiet homes, far from prying eyes. Economists, engineers, farmers, and strategists gathered, united by a singular vision, reclaiming Africa's right to determine its own destiny. Discussions were punctuated by the crackle of old radios and the scratch of pens on paper, maps of trade routes and mineral reserves spread across makeshift tables. There was fear, certainly, but there was also resolve, a sense that history itself was watching, waiting for someone brave enough to act. Traoré's strategy was meticulous. Each move calculated to shock, each decision designed to disrupt, yet nothing reckless. International law was a cage, but a cage whose locks he understood intimately. By bending the rules, he could create leverage. By defying precedent, he could craft freedom. Whispers of his plans reached foreign capitals before they even materialized, triggering closed-door meetings and emergency conferences. Diplomatic cables leaked hints of his audacity, sending shivers through embassies that had long assumed control over African resources and policies. The people of Burkina Faso began to sense the winds of change. Even before the first decree was announced, farmers tilled the earth with cautious hope. Merchants whispered of opportunities they had never dared imagine, and children played under skies that seemed, for the first time in years, unburdened by invisible constraints. Traoré walked among them, observing not with pride but with the solemn gravity of one who understood the stakes. Every step, every word, every decision bore the weight of a nation teetering on the edge between stagnation and unprecedented liberation. Night after night, he faced sleepless contemplation. Reports of impending sanctions arrived like thunderclaps. Foreign intelligence hinted at plots to undermine him, and allies wavered in fear. Yet in the quiet moments, as moonlight filtered through the thin curtains of his office, Traoré envisioned a future where Burkina Faso, and perhaps all of Africa, could stand independently. A nation no longer dictated by external decrees, no longer shackled by decades of compliance. The image of bustling markets, thriving industries, and a currency that commanded respect filled his mind, a beacon of hope against the looming storm. And then came the first official tremor. A speech broadcast nationally, unassuming yet profound, declared Burkina Faso's intent to reclaim control over its policies and wealth. The world recoiled. Financial analysts scrambled. Ambassadors demanded explanations. Newspapers splashed the story across every continent. Leaders whispered in fear and fascination. A small African nation led by a resolute man, challenging centuries of global expectation. Some called him reckless. Others called him visionary. Traoré simply called it necessary. Even as the international uproar grew, the internal struggles intensified. Ministers quarreled over the pace of reforms, military leaders expressed cautious dissent, and journalists questioned the boundaries of legality. Traoré welcomed these challenges. He understood that leadership was not the absence of opposition, but the ability to navigate it with conviction. Each obstacle became a testament to the resilience he sought to instill in his nation, a lesson that freedom demanded sacrifice, courage, and unyielding commitment. As the sun set over Ouagadougou, casting long shadows across the city, Ibrahim Traoré looked beyond the immediate chaos. He understood that laws were only as powerful as those who obeyed them, and that sometimes breaking them was the first step toward true justice. The weight of history pressed upon him, but instead of crushing his spirit, it galvanized him. Every decision, every calculated risk, every act of defiance was a thread weaving the tapestry of a new future. And as the night deepened, one thought resonated above all. The world would soon witness an African leader whose courage would challenge the rules of power itself. The first tremors of Traoré's audacious policies rippled across the continent like an unseen earthquake. He moved swiftly, quietly, and with precision. Burkina Faso would no longer submit blindly to foreign dictates. Contracts once considered untouchable were revisited, renegotiated, and in some cases outright annulled. Banking institutions that had long acted as intermediaries for outside interests now found themselves subject to national oversight. International finance was stunned. In New York, London, and Paris, analysts stared at their screens, trying to parse the implications, their faces a mix of disbelief and panic. In Moscow, Xi's advisors furrowed brows at encrypted cables describing moves that defied convention. Traoré had crossed lines no one imagined a young African leader could breach. Inside Burkina Faso, the people felt the first sparks of hope. Farmers were allowed to trade crops freely across borders, without the suffocating tariffs that had for decades siphoned profits abroad. Artisans who had once struggled to sell their goods overseas now found a market hungry for African independence. Yet with progress came friction. Traoré's inner circle was a delicate network of loyalty and doubt. Some ministers whispered against him, fearful of sanctions and political retribution. 3 senior generals, men once trusted as pillars of the military, began to quietly question his vision, murmuring about legality and caution. They did not yet know the full scope of his intentions, only that he was dismantling decades of tradition and protocol. And in their hearts fear began to fester. Traoré, ever meticulous, had anticipated dissent. He held secret councils with economists, regional leaders, and trusted generals, explaining in careful detail the necessity of each move. He did not preach, he reasoned. Maps sprawled across tables, showing new trade routes, recalculated reserves, and autonomous financial systems. Analysts from across Africa were flown in under the cover of night, their discussions forming a clandestine blueprint for a continent that could thrive independently. Even among whispers of betrayal, a quiet loyalty grew. Those who understood that he was not breaking laws for personal gain, but for collective liberation. Meanwhile, the international community reacted predictably, but with a flavor of panic. Reports of sanctions began circulating almost immediately. The IMF, threatened by Traoré's defiance, froze certain assets, sending waves of uncertainty through global markets. Credit lines were withheld, investments delayed, and foreign aid dangled like a fragile carrot on a stick. Western media painted him as reckless, irresponsible, a danger to the economic order. Yet behind closed doors, some whispered admiration. Rarely had an African leader moved with such clarity and decisiveness against the entrenched machinery of global influence. Amid the chaos, the ordinary citizens of Burkina Faso experienced life in its starkest contrasts. Mothers who had endured famine now glimpsed abundance, yet the fear of collapse lingered. Soldiers who had once doubted their country's leadership now watched with cautious optimism, witnessing a man willing to gamble everything for the future of his people. Markets teetered between turmoil and promise. Factories hummed with renewed energy, and streets, long subdued, pulsed with cautious anticipation. Each day felt like walking a tightrope above a canyon, but Traoré's composure inspired quiet courage. There were shadows, of course. Encrypted messages hinted at espionage. Anonymous tips suggested foreign intelligence agents were embedded within government agencies, quietly attempting to undermine his reforms. Rumors of an internal coup circulated among generals, though none dared act outright. Traoré, unshaken, treated every whisper as part of the larger game, a game he had already anticipated, calculated, and planned for. His brilliance was not merely in defiance, but in foresight. Every law bent, every regulation challenged, was a step toward a carefully orchestrated outcome, the liberation of his nation from invisible chains. Across the continent, neighboring leaders observed his moves with a mix of envy and fear. Some began to quietly emulate his tactics, testing the limits of their own national autonomy. Economists speculated about a new model of African economic independence, one where resource management, currency stabilization, and trade sovereignty were not dictated from beyond the continent. The seeds of a continental shift were quietly planted, even as the world's most powerful men scrambled to regain control of a narrative they thought unshakable. At home, Ibrahim Traoré walked among his people, often unnoticed. He visited villages, marketplaces, and schools, listening more than speaking. The ordinary acts of leadership, examining infrastructure projects, attending local councils, offering quiet reassurance, were juxtaposed against his monumental political gambits. The people sensed that something unprecedented was unfolding. There was danger, yes, but also a strange electricity in the air, a feeling that their nation was reclaiming dignity, autonomy, and promise after decades of silent suffering. Yet the tension could not be ignored. The general's quiet discontent grew bolder. Plots were whispered in hallways and hidden rooms. The threat of betrayal loomed like a storm cloud over the capital. Foreign media continued to attack, labeling him reckless and unpredictable. Markets fluctuated wildly, and some citizens, unused to such rapid change, questioned whether the risks might outweigh the potential reward. But Traoré remained a figure of calm amid the storm, a man fully aware that history only favors those willing to bear the weight of defiance. As months passed, the outlines of a new Burkina Faso began to emerge. Currency stabilization initiatives, newly negotiated trade agreements, and regulatory reforms all signaled a nation slowly regaining control over its destiny. Traoré's audacity became a symbol not just for Burkina Faso, but for an entire continent that had long been told its place in the world was fixed, predetermined, and submissive. Yet with every step forward, danger increased. Allies could falter, generals could strike, and the world could retaliate. Each day was a calculated risk, a dangerous dance between innovation and catastrophe, and still, he pressed on. Every law he bent, every system he challenged, was a deliberate act of liberation. He became a living paradox, simultaneously the calm architect and the storm itself. Burkina Faso was changing, not through rhetoric, not through empty promises, but through a man willing to confront the world's most entrenched powers. From the streets of Ouagadougou to the corridors of foreign capitals, the narrative was clear. Ibrahim Traoré had begun a revolution not of guns alone, but of strategy, courage, and unflinching vision. By the end of the year, whispers of his next move circulated like wildfire. Would he extend reforms to neighboring countries? Would the global powers retaliate with unprecedented force? The tension was palpable, the stakes higher than ever. Yet among the people, hope had taken root, subtle but unshakable. The stage was set for a confrontation unlike any the world had ever seen, a test not of armies, but of intellect, courage, and the relentless pursuit of freedom. And through it all, Ibrahim Traoré stood firm, knowing that the greatest challenges always precede the most extraordinary transformations. The world could no longer look away. News anchors in New York, London, and Beijing spoke in hushed, urgent tones as Burkina Faso's bold defiance reverberated across continents. Traoré had announced sweeping economic reforms, restructuring trade agreements, reclaiming foreign-held assets, and establishing a new national financial system designed to free his country from the grip of decades-old treaties. Analysts scrambled to quantify the repercussions, diplomats demanded explanations, and leaders who once considered Africa a predictable chessboard now found themselves outmaneuvered. For the first time in memory, the global order was watching a small African nation dictate the rules. Within Burkina Faso, the tension was electric. Ministers who had once doubted Traoré's vision now oscillated between admiration and fear. Three of the most senior generals, men with influence over the military and whispers of private loyalties, began moving subtly against him. Their conversations, whispered in shadowed corridors, hinted at mutiny and resistance. Traoré knew their thoughts before they were fully formed. He had anticipated doubt as part of the plan. Every cautious glance, every hushed conversation, was a piece on a board he had studied for months. The ordinary citizens, meanwhile, felt both hope and uncertainty. Farmers, merchants, and schoolchildren observed the unfolding revolution in real time, a nation being remade before their eyes. Markets fluctuated as currency reforms rolled out, yet there was energy in the air, a pulse of anticipation and cautious optimism. Mothers whispered to their children about a future they had never dared imagine, while workers rebuilt factories and roads, imagining a country unshackled from decades of external control. Freedom was a concept they had only glimpsed in stories. Now it was unfolding around them, fragile but real. Outside the borders, the reactions escalated. Foreign governments applied economic pressure, threatening sanctions and freezing accounts. The IMF demanded immediate compliance, warning of dire consequences. International media painted Traoré as reckless, a maverick leader risking the stability of his nation. Yet with every threat, his resolve strengthened. He understood that the perception of instability was the very lever he needed to shift the balance of power in favor of his people. He was not reckless. He was calculated, daring, and unflinchingly bold. Amid this chaos, mysterious forces began to emerge. Anonymous messages, carefully encrypted and delivered through trusted intermediaries, warned of potential betrayals from within his own government. Spies from foreign intelligence agencies moved in the shadows, attempting to intercept strategies, sow discord, and manipulate markets. But Traoré had anticipated them all. Each threat became a puzzle piece, each act of deception a test of his foresight. The intrigue heightened the stakes. The lines between friend and foe blurred, and every decision felt like balancing on the edge of a blade. Inside the presidential offices, Traoré orchestrated reforms with the precision of a master strategist. Nationalized industries were revitalized, trade agreements renegotiated, and a new digital currency introduced, giving Burkina Faso unprecedented autonomy. Yet the generals remained a lurking threat, plotting in quiet corners, their uncertainty growing into frustration and anger. They underestimated him, assuming that legality and tradition would always prevail. Traoré had learned from history. Power often resides in the unexpected, in those willing to challenge the boundaries imposed upon them. As tensions mounted, the generals made their first overt move, a calculated act designed to intimidate, to test loyalty, and to exploit fear. But Traoré, anticipating every possible action, had already positioned loyal allies and implemented contingencies. The confrontation was subtle yet explosive, a battle of intellect, influence, and strategy, rather than arms. Every minister, every soldier, every citizen became a witness to the delicate choreography of power being rewritten. International observers watched in disbelief as Burkina Faso navigated these crises. Markets stabilized despite foreign threats. Public confidence grew, fueled by transparent governance and visible improvements in daily life. Children attended school without fear, farmers traded freely, and the streets pulsed with cautious optimism. The world had expected chaos, yet what emerged was control, discipline, and progress, the signature of a leader whose courage had reshaped his nation. Even as the general's frustration mounted, Traoré pressed forward. He introduced innovative policies designed to redistribute wealth, stimulate local industries, and build infrastructure capable of sustaining long-term independence. These moves were audacious, even revolutionary, challenging not only external powers, but the entrenched assumptions within his own nation. People began to whisper about him in hushed reverence, calling him the architect of a new Africa, a visionary capable of bending the old rules to create a freer, stronger future. But the danger had not passed. Threats, both internal and external, loomed larger than ever. The IMF hinted at legal maneuvers, foreign governments plotted behind closed doors, and the generals considered bolder measures. Yet in every act of defiance, every strategic risk, Traoré remained calm. He moved with deliberate purpose, aware that the world was watching, waiting for him to falter. The suspense was palpable, a nation hanging on the edge of transformation. The global order challenged in ways no one had anticipated. As the act drew to a close, Burkina Faso had become a symbol of daring and possibility. The people were invested in their future, the generals were cornered by the inevitability of reform, and the world was forced to confront the reality of African agency. Traoré had ignited a movement that no law, no sanction, and no whisper of betrayal could contain. Every step brought him closer to a confrontation that would define not only his leadership, but the destiny of an entire continent. And in the quiet moments, when the sun set over Ouagadougou, he considered the path ahead, knowing that the most decisive moves were still to come, moves that would shock the world, rewrite the rules and build a freedom long denied. The world had reached the tipping point. Capitals trembled as news of Burkina Faso's latest moves spread like wildfire. Traoré had unveiled a comprehensive plan, foreign-held assets reclaimed, national industries revitalized, and a new digital currency introduced, a currency that could stand independently, free from decades of foreign control. Analysts scrambled to comprehend the audacity. Diplomats convened emergency sessions, their voices tense with disbelief. Leaders who once dismissed Burkina Faso as peripheral now regarded it with caution, envy, and unease. Ibrahim Traoré had become a symbol of calculated defiance, a man daring to bend the rules of a world that had long dictated the terms of African nations. Inside the country, the tension was electric. The three generals, long simmering in quiet opposition, began openly challenging his authority. They questioned every decision, seeking to exploit hesitation, believing that legality and fear would sway the population. Traoré, however, anticipated every move. He had cultivated loyal allies within the military and civil service, carefully placing individuals capable of executing his vision and countering dissent. Every action by the generals was met with precise, strategic measures, a chess game played on a continent-wide stage, invisible to the untrained eye but lethal in effect. The citizens of Burkina Faso, once cautious and tentative, now felt a surge of empowerment. Markets thrummed with renewed activity. Farmers traded without interference. Small businesses flourished as the bureaucracy of foreign dependency was dismantled. The air was thick with anticipation. People whispered of a leader who dared to challenge the world, a man willing to risk sanctions, isolation, and personal peril for the promise of freedom. Children waved small flags in towns and cities. Mothers shared stories of hope. Young men and women believed for the first time that their nation could command its own destiny. International pressure escalated. Sanctions were threatened, accounts frozen, and trade negotiations severed. Journalists portrayed Traoré as reckless, an unpredictable force that could destabilize the region. Yet behind the rhetoric, many watched in awe. Rarely had an African leader demonstrated such precision, intelligence, and courage. Traoré was not acting on impulse. He was executing a meticulously crafted plan designed to liberate his people while neutralizing threats. Each public announcement, each strategic maneuver, was a masterstroke of political theater and governance. The generals, desperate to maintain influence, launched a series of covert operations intended to intimidate, destabilize, and disrupt. Rumors of sabotage, economic manipulation, and clandestine alliances reached the public in whispers. But Traoré remained unshaken. Through subtle coordination, loyal forces thwarted every move. Key allies had been positioned months prior to ensure the stability of critical infrastructure and public confidence. Every attempted disruption became a demonstration of his foresight and control. In the capital, the streets became a theater of quiet triumph. Citizens, sensing the winds of change, participated in rebuilding efforts, trade expansion, and civic projects. Schools reopened with renewed vigor, markets flourished, and public spaces became hubs of energy and optimism. Even as external pressures mounted, the internal transformation was undeniable. Burkina Faso had become a living testament to the possibility of liberation through bold, intelligent defiance. Traoré's most daring maneuver came in the form of a digital currency initiative, designed to stabilize the economy and assert financial independence. The world watched, skeptical and anxious, as the currency was deployed. Transactions flourished, and local businesses adapted rapidly. Other African nations began to take note, quietly exploring similar measures. The general's influence waned as public support and economic momentum shifted irreversibly in favor of Traoré's vision. Burkina Faso had become both a symbol and a proving ground. The global order, once confident in its ability to enforce compliance, was forced to confront the reality that one man, acting with courage and intellect, could rewrite the rules. Traoré's defiance was no longer an abstract concept. It was a tangible, measurable transformation, affecting millions of lives. His actions had triggered a movement, a ripple of empowerment and autonomy that extended far beyond the borders of his nation. As night fell over Ouagadougou, the capital hummed with energy. Citizens walked streets they had long felt powerless on, traders negotiated deals with newfound confidence, and government officials, once paralyzed by fear, acted decisively. Traoré stood at the center of it all, calm and unyielding, a man whose vision had defied expectation and reshaped destiny. The world had watched, waited, and doubted. But the outcome was undeniable. A nation, once constrained by the laws of others, now moved freely under the guidance of a leader willing to risk everything to reclaim its future. Even as challenges remained, whispers of external retaliation, ongoing economic negotiations, and lingering threats from dissenters, the trajectory was clear. Burkina Faso had begun its transformation, led by a man whose courage had turned uncertainty into hope, fear into confidence, and compliance into empowerment. Traoré had proven that freedom could be carved from the unlikeliest of circumstances, and that the laws which bind nations are only as powerful as those willing to enforce them. The stage was set for resolution. The general's plots had been contained, the citizens had embraced the new order, and the world was coming to terms with a reality it had long refused to consider. That sometimes, true leadership requires breaking the rules, challenging the established order, and daring to build freedom where none had existed before. Time passed and the transformation became undeniable. Burkina Faso, once seen as a fragile state at the mercy of international powers, now stood resilient and independent. Traoré's policies had taken root. Industries flourished, farmers traded without interference, and a new digital currency stabilized the economy. What had once been whispered hopes became tangible reality. The streets of Ouagadougou, alive with energy, told a story of revival. Children played freely, markets buzzed with opportunity, and citizens walked with pride they had long been denied. The generals, who had once plotted against him, were either reconciled into the new system or removed quietly, their power eclipsed by the sweeping reforms. Internal dissent had been transformed into constructive participation. Those who had feared change now became allies, contributing their skills to the nation's unprecedented renaissance. Traoré's brilliance had not merely dismantled opposition. It had redirected it toward nation-building, turning potential chaos into progress. Across Africa, the ripple effect was immediate. Leaders of neighboring nations watched in awe and apprehension, inspired by the boldness of a man who had dared to defy global expectations. Discussions began in capitals across the continent. not of whether they could challenge the old order, but how. Traoré had demonstrated that African nations could reclaim agency over their destinies, that sovereignty need not be a word on paper, but a reality lived by every citizen. Economists, politicians, and everyday people debated, studied, and quietly emulated his methods. A sense of possibility had been awakened. The international community, forced to adapt, recalibrated its approach. Sanctions were lifted gradually as Burkina Faso proved stability and competence under Traoré's leadership. Governments that had derided him now acknowledged the effectiveness of his reforms, albeit grudgingly. Global media shifted its tone, portraying him not as a reckless rebel, but as a visionary who had reshaped the rules of engagement. He had challenged the world, and in doing so, had commanded respect without compromise. At home, the impact was deeply personal. Mothers no longer worried about empty plates, children attended school with renewed hope, and young adults envisioned futures previously unimaginable. Traoré's leadership had turned despair into opportunity, scarcity into abundance, and compliance into empowerment. Every citizen became a participant in the nation's rebirth, witnesses to a man who had broken laws not for ego, but for liberation. Traoré himself remained humble amid the accolades. He knew the fight was not over, that vigilance would always be required to protect the sovereignty he had reclaimed. Yet he also understood the power of precedent. By daring to act where others hesitated, he had reshaped what was possible for his people, for his nation, and for a continent long denied full autonomy. His courage had proven that freedom was not given. It was claimed, sometimes against the rules, sometimes against expectation, always against fear. In the months that followed, Burkina Faso became a model, a beacon of innovation, resilience, and independence. The economy strengthened, trade prospered, and social programs flourished. Other African nations began quietly adopting similar frameworks, inspired by the audacity and clarity of Traoré's vision. The continent, long constrained by external dictates, now glimpsed a path toward self-determination, economic strength, and unity. And in the quiet moments, when the sun set over Ouagadougou and the streets settled into calm, Ibrahim Traoré reflected on what had been achieved. He had defied expectation, challenged entrenched power, and faced dangers both visible and unseen. Yet in every decision, every risk, every act of courage, he had remained steadfast in his purpose, to build freedom for his people. The story concluded not with fanfare, but with profound resonance. Traoré had become more than a leader. He had become a symbol of African empowerment, a testament to the power of vision, courage, and moral resolve. As the continent slowly rose, he asked the silent, rhetorical question that echoed across generations. When the laws are broken for justice, does the world finally learn what freedom truly means? And as the camera of history lingered on the capital, the people, and the quiet strength of a leader who refused to yield, one truth emerged. This was not rebellion. This was a rebirth. This was the dawn of a new era.